Thank you for joining us, both in person and online. The lecture that Paul will give is entitled Museum Conservation, the Forensis of Provenance. And I met Paul for the first time in 2011 at University College London. And Paul, at the moment, is a professor of anthropology at the University of Oxford and a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum. He is also the president of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association and chair of the scientific board of MUDEC, or Museo delle Culture, in Milan. Paul specializes in critical heritage, museum and material culture studies in transcultural contexts, and he draws upon a wide range of ethnographic, historical, and participatory methods to explore how pasts are materialized and mediated in the present and how they shape futures. His research explores the complex ways in which natural as well as cultural heritage is entangled in shifting regimes of value and geopolitical configurations. His work has often involved re-engagements with colonial archives and collections related to West Africa. He has designed and curated numerous exhibitions and museum spaces. So today, Paul will draw upon case studies to rethink provenance research, shifting our attention from the forensic investigation into the origins and chains of ownership of objects, to a relational process, which brings together a community of stakeholders and perspectives. Please help me welcoming Paul Basu.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks everyone for coming along. I'd like to also thank the Getty Conservation Institute and the Fowler Museum for co-hosting today's event, and to Glenn, Erica, and Anna, especially for joining in the conversation, and of course to Vula, who invited me along, and I'm looking forward to spending the week working with her and colleagues to explore some various shared interests and so on. I'm going to read my presentation because in my body, it's 1 o'clock in the morning in the UK. I just arrived last night, so just so I stick on script, as it were, so forgive me for that. So in the last decade, the work of provenance research has taken on a new politicized status, particularly within ethnographic world cultures or world art museums. And this reflects a wider demand to address the ongoing legacies of colonialism in society and the impact of social justice movements, such as Rhodes Must Fall and Black Lives Matter, in cultural institutions. Provenance research has become a forensic practice, not only in the sense of entailing painstaking forms of inquiry, but particularly in relation to issues of law and ethics. Much provenance research is now undertaken not to establish the authenticity and value of an artwork, but to reassess the legitimacy of institutions' ownership and control of collections. Following the Washington Conference principles relating to Nazi looted art, the onus has increasingly been placed on museums to proactively investigate the circumstances in which collections were acquired, even if they themselves acquired them in good faith. In the ethnographic space, this research is often focused on collections amassed in the colonial era. Just last year, a committee of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association, of which Erica Jones here was co-chair, published recommendations concerning the ethical stewardship of African collections in US museums, which included guidelines on provenance research and restitution. Of course, provenance research is nothing new, and there have been previous calls to develop a more critical approach to such practice. The Getty's own 2013 publication, edited by Gail Feigenbaum and Inga Reist, is a good example of this, particularly the concluding essay by Anne Higonnet, The Social Life of Provenance, which draws directly on anthropological theories of exchange and value transformation. Focusing on the famous Idia ivory pendant mask from Benin City in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Higonnet draws our attention to the way in which provenance information is presented on the museum label. Note, for example, the strings of owners' names separated by semicolons. Those punctuation marks replace verbs, Higonnet writes. They replace history and replace meaning. She goes on, it is in the place of those marks that the most crucial parts of provenance occur. Each punctuation mark signifies an exchange of possession, which is also always an exchange of some sort of value. Even more significant is that typographic gap between the description of the object, what archaeologists term provenience, the origin or original context of an object, and the list of subsequent owners it is passed between. Higonnet writes, the little white space between the two lists hides a huge leap across time and space. In the gap are hidden the dramas of global power dynamics, military conquest, massive movements of wealth from one continent to another, and the tragedies of racism. In the case of the idiopendent mask, it is only too easy to fill that gap and to trace the various exchanges elided by the semicolons. The mask is, of course, implicated in one of the most notorious cases of colonial looting amidst the British military conquest of the Benin Kingdom in 1897. It formed part of the treasure personally seized by Sir Ralph Moore, one of the architects of the punitive expedition, and was acquired by the anthropologist C.G. Seligman in 1909 after Moore's suicide. Following Seligman's death, it was acquired by Nelson Rockefeller and subsequently gifted to the Met. Benin collections have been at the center of recent restitution debates, and many museums which hold Benin material have conducted extensive provenance research projects, often in anticipation of repatriation claims. Much of this work has been forensic, insofar as it has sought to determine degrees of certainty regarding whether particular pieces were technically looted from Benin in 1897 or not. And you can see a kind of typology that was in this kind of Swiss museum context of this, determining different kind of likelihoods or certainties regarding whether the objects were looted in a technical sense or not. Based on these findings, an increasing number of institutions have returned or agreed to return Benin collections to Nigeria. The Smithsonian, for instance, returned 29 so-called bronzes in 2022. One of the reasons why the Benin artworks have been so prominent in these debates is surely the unequivocal nature of their seizure in 1897 in the context of colonial military violence. Regardless of their present legal status, the ethical case for return seems clear-cut. And yet, even such apparently ethical contexts where there's this ethical certainty, even that certainty has been questioned. The New York-based Restitution Study Group, which claims to represent the descendants of those sold into slavery by the Obas of Benin, sought an injunction, for instance, to prevent the return of the artworks from the Smithsonian. This is based on the claim that the metal used to make the bronzes, which are actually brass, was derived from manillas, one of the currencies used in the transatlantic trade, and known to have been exchanged for their enslaved ancestors. Indeed, the wealth of the Benin Kingdom in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries was amassed through trade with the Portuguese and other Europeans, including the trade in enslaved peoples captured through its own territorial expansion. The plaques themselves depict Portuguese traders with their manillas and celebrate not Benin's subservience to the Europeans, but rather their mastery of the market. While the association between manillas, the slave trade, and the Benin bronzes is known from historical sources, recent advances in lead isotope analysis have confirmed this. The German materials scientist Tobias Skoronek, in particular, has been conducting analysis on manillas, which have been dated to the period of the Portuguese trade with Benin, and this shows a close correlation between the metallurgy of the artworks and the manillas. Indeed, Skoronek's research shows a European origin for the metal ores of the manillas and their likely production in Stolberg in the northern Rhineland. Indeed, his work shows how thoroughly integrated with European finance, mining, manufacturing, trade, and shipping was the slave trade, its currencies, and by extension, these artworks. But as one online article states, does this matter? Or if it does matter, how might it matter? And this is perhaps not such an easy question for us to answer. So this brings us to the main issue that I'd like to think about in relation to provenance research. And this is also grounded in the anthropological theories of exchange that Anne Higonnet drew upon in her article on provenance. There is, firstly, a shift to regard provenance research as not being only about uncovering the origins and chains of ownership of an object, but about understanding the fuller cultural biography of things. Such a perspective, explored in the classic volume edited by Arjuna Padurai, The Social Life of Things, unsettles any fixed or unitary understanding of what a thing is. Rather, it helps us to understand the mutability of things and the different regimes of value that they pass through. This raises questions that challenge the ethical certainties that underpin many contemporary debates around restitution. I do want to make clear, however, that I'm not arguing against restitution. Rather, I'm proposing that there is a need for a more nuanced ethical debate around these issues. Hence the shift from a forensics of provenance to a forensis of provenance, noting that the word forensic is derived from the Latin forensis, meaning of the forum. I'm interested in the idea that provenance research may be rethought then, as a forum or space of ethical reflection that brings together different perspectives, different forms of expertise, differently culturally situated understandings of what a thing is. Things are undergoing constant transformation. If we take as the starting point of the Benin artworks the act of looting amidst colonial violence in West Africa in 1897, their subsequent transformation into commodities on the European antiquities market, and their display in museums as trophies of empire, then the ethical case for return seems straightforward. But the biographies of these things, including the biographies of the materials from which they are made, and the multiple injustices in which they are entangled over a longer historical period, are more complicated. And despite our desire for ethical certainty, we are forced to confront ethical ambiguities and uncertainties. So, in what follows, I'd like to draw upon some of my own collaborative projects to think about different dimensions of this forensis of provenance. For instance, how such a forum brings together different culturally and professionally situated forms of knowing, how we might embrace such plurality and embrace the generative possibilities of uncertainty. At the same time, it is imperative to acknowledge the power relations in this and experiences of the ongoing coloniality of cultural institutions. The forensis of provenance necessitates a relinquishing of institutional authority and a recognition that the curatorial voice, for instance, is merely one voice among many. There is a plurality of legitimate voices and a plurality of ways of constituting legitimacy. Firstly, then, I'd like to talk about my contribution to a project called Dismantling Welcome at the Wellcome Collection in London. In 2020, a decision was made to close what was called the Medicine Man Gallery at the museum, which had been devoted to the collecting interests of the museum's founder, the pharmaceutical entrepreneur Henry Wellcome. It was felt that the gallery was out of step with current museum politics, especially given the unacknowledged colonial contexts from which the collections came. Prior to being dismantled, there was an initiative to invite writers, artists, academics, and activists to each select an item on display in the gallery and to write an alternative label for the object. As per the example here, the labels were printed on blue cards, and they were intended to disrupt the supposedly neutral, authoritative texts authored by the museum. I was invited to participate and selected this object, described on its label as an antelope horn amulet that had been purchased for the Wellcome collection in 1932 and, to quote, was reported to have been used by a powerful medicine man in Nigeria to heal and ward off disease. I was interested in this reference to the Nigerian medicine man and the characterization of Henry Wellcome himself as another kind of medicine man, as was reflected in the title of the gallery. But I was also interested in the provocation represented by this object, as typical of a certain kind of colonial-era ethnographic curio, not least in its incorporation of a human jawbone at a time when the display of human remains in museums is increasingly contested. What started as the writing of an alternative blue label transformed into this much more elaborate installation as the museum agreed to allow me to exhibit the sources from which I drew my text intervention. And this included showing the museum documentation which most conventional approaches to provenance research rely on, an inventory card which cross-referenced a museum register book, which in turn listed the auction at which the object was acquired, for which the museum retained an annotated catalogue. It is interesting to note that in these 3 documents alone, the object undergoes multiple transformations and changes of identity, from lot number 332 to register number 5437 to accession number 127047, from a powerful medicine man's juju to fetish to medicine and subsequently amulet. Quite typical of documentation relating to ethnographic collections, here we reach what Saidiya Hartman describes as the constitutional limit of the archive. We are unable to trace the object beyond the sale on July 2nd, 1932 at a London auction room and the unreliable witness of the sales catalogue that states that the object came from Nigeria and was used by, quote, a powerful medicine man. Where then to turn for further insight into this object? With the museum's blessing, I posted a picture of the object to a Nigerian Heritage Facebook group that I was a member of, inviting members to help identify the object and offering to incorporate a selection of their comments in the label intervention. This elicited a huge number of responses, and this is just a selection of the comments from the thread. One could say that this represents the voice of the source community. But of course, what is interesting is that there was no consensus about the object at all. Rather, there was an extensive debate about what the object was, what it was not, where it had come from, and where it should return to. The object accessioned as 127047 was evidently not one thing, but many. Juxtaposed with the object in its original label, we created this blue panel with the museum documentation on one side of my text and a screen on the other on which we animated a selection of the Nigerian Heritage Facebook group comments. And this is what I wrote under the title, Potent Provocation. Museums are filled with ellipses, speculations, and unanswered questions. What is this? What does it do? Where does it belong? And to whom? It was acquired for that other powerful medicine man, Henry Wellcome, in 1932 at Glendinning and Company's auction rooms, London, for the sum of £4. A collectible commodity then, entangled in the geographies and inequalities of colonial exchange. Accessioned first as juju, then as medicine, now as amulet, it is no doubt a potent thing. but one might relabel it, along with everything else in this room, a potent provocation. Ndubuisi says that it is from Ohafia region in southeastern Nigeria. Taiwo says it is Afose from the southwest. Others ask, was it taken from Sokoto in the north or from the Oba's palace in Benin? It is no amulet, says Busola. It looks like Ologbohun, says Labi. It is more powerful than Afose. Wale says that it is so powerful that no one would have dared sell it. It could not even have been displayed publicly. It is dangerous. It will wreak havoc. Blood sustains its potency, human blood. But Ada reminds us, the Oibo use them decorate house. Idols are nothing in this world, says Okachukwu. It is an antelope's horn and a dead man's jawbone, nothing more. So I've already invoked various forms of knowledge that might inform provenance research. Museum documentation, part of that wider colonial archive with its absences and distortions. Material sciences, members of source communities. I'd now like to turn to museum conservation as another way of knowing and relating to objects. And here I'll draw upon an example from the Reentanglements project that I ran a few years ago. This was a multidisciplinary research and exhibition project which focused on various approaches to re-engaging with a remarkable ethnographic archive of objects, photographs, sound recordings, field notes, botanical specimens, and so forth, all assembled by this man, Northcote Thomas, in the course of a series of anthropological surveys in southern Nigeria and Sierra Leone in the early 20th century. The project involved retracing the journeys made by Thomas, returning copies of photographs and sound recordings, for instance, to descendant communities, but also many collaborations with Nigerian and Sierra Leonean artists, musicians, storytellers, and so on. Here, however, I focus on one object and a collaboration with my colleague Carmen Vida, a conservator who was then based at the UCLA Institute of Archaeology, where I also taught for some years. Along with Dean Sully, Carmen oversaw the conservation of a selection of objects from Thomas's collections, now housed at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, prior to a year-long exhibition also held in Cambridge entitled Reentanglements, Colonial Collections in Decolonial Times. This decorated pot was one of the objects that featured in the exhibition. It was collected by Thomas in Benin City in February 1909, just 12 years after that infamous punitive expedition. On the front of the pot is a representation of the Edo deity Olokun, which is associated with water and fertility. As Thomas documented in photographs, field notes, and publications, pots such as these would have been placed on altars in shrines dedicated to Olokun, and they would have contained water, chalk, and other medicines. It is unlikely, however, that Thomas took this Olokun pot from a shrine. He photographed it, for instance, along with other clay pots that he had purchased at a market prior to having them shipped to Britain. It is not clear whether they were acquired at this particular market, which he photographed on February 6, 1909. If not, it would have certainly been one like it. Unfortunately, the majority of the ceramics that Thomas shipped to Britain were badly damaged in transit and are bagged up as shards in the museum to this day. The Olokun pot was also shattered, but at some point, and we're not quite sure when, an attempt was made to repair it, though as you can see from these photographs, it remains in quite very poor condition and a very fragile state. So one intervention that we undertook as part of the Reentanglements project was to commission a new Olokun pot to be made by the Ihama family, one of the traditional brass casting families in Igun Street in Benin. The intention here was to make a material link with the Benin bronzes, of which examples could also be found in the Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, which are now in the process of being restituted. Here, however, I want to focus on the collaboration with Carmen. After much discussion about how best to honour the original Olokun pot, and with the agreement of the museum, it was decided to take the bold action to undo the previous repair, bring down the pot to its constituent fragments, and then reassemble it using contemporary conservation materials and techniques. The reassembly part of the process alone took 26 days, and we decided to document this using time-lapse photography. I also interviewed Carmen about the process, and from this material I edited a 5-minute video. You can see, if you're interested, the URL, the YouTube URL there, of which I'm going to show you a little clip now. Needless to say, as conservator, Carmen developed a remarkable intimacy with the pot through this process, an intimate knowledge comparable perhaps only with that of the unknown artist who originally made the pot some 110 years or more before. So I'll play just the last minute and a half of the film once the reconstruction is more or less complete.
Working with objects as a conservator, you sort of create a relationship with the object that is a very close one. For me, conservation is a lot about narrative. We are creating a narrative from the point in which we start understanding an object in its makeup, in its technology, in its materials, to the point at which we have received that object and we have to do something with it. And the narrative continues into the future because I have to make decisions as to, I'm the next stage in the history of that ceramic. I am not a neutral agent there. I'm not taking it back to what it was. I'm creating something new with what I've been given. And therefore, I have to make decisions based on that history, to carry on that history of the object. As a conservator, I have to make choices. I'm the next stage in the history of that pot. I'm not a passive agent. I'm not neutral. I am doing things to it and making decisions as to how to put it back together, how to fill the gaps. Those fills will become part of the history of the object and part of its visual history as well. So I'm an agent in the history of the Olokun pot, but I'm hoping that I'm not a disassociated agent, that I'm an agent that at least is trying to be aware of the different stories and histories of the pot.
Do have a look at the longer version if you can, if you have an opportunity to, where she talks about the wider process. And here's Carmen encountering the reconstructed pot as we were installing it in the exhibition, juxtaposed with the brass skeuomorph and Thomas's photograph of it from 1909. In the film, Carmen speaks eloquently about the relationship between the conservator and the object she is working on, about the deep understanding the conservator develops, not just of the physical artifact, but also about its cultural context and significance, and about her responsibility as an agent in the ongoing story of the object. We debated at length how visible Carmen's joins and fills should be, and although they're not so clear in this photograph, we agreed that it was important that they remained visible, such that there was no attempt to hide the trauma that the pot had experienced. Indeed, as you can see, as well as the brass replica and the photograph, we exhibited the pot alongside a pile of the broken shards of pots, you can see just in the bottom right there, that Thomas had also sent. And the accompanying text panel discusses this process of damage and reconstruction. Together, these raised questions about the possibilities and impossibilities of repair in the aftermath of colonial violence. And the Olokun pot became one of the material metaphors we developed and deployed in the exhibition, through which to think about colonial legacies in decolonial times. And indeed, this is part of the broader concept of this exhibition, that the exhibition should be about posing questions using these materials. It should be, as with that earlier case study, a series of provocations to audiences, and indeed inviting audiences to engage in the conversation about the ethics, the legacies of those histories within the space of the exhibition. So this idea of forensis again, this forum that engages the visitor to the exhibition too. Another of those material metaphors was the idea of entanglement itself, and you can see these designs on the walls were actually extrapolated from string figures that Thomas had photographed as well, these kind of cat's cradle type of things. So this notion that one was literally entangled, as it were, in the context and forced, as it were, to think through, to form a position in relation to the material presented. Interestingly, the repaired pot has itself become somewhat iconic and features in a section of the digital Benin platform illustrating the broader category of Akeo Osun, pots used on the shrines of different deities. And indeed, both the repaired pot and the brass skeuomorph are now returning to Benin City on long-term loan to form part of the displays of the new Museum of West African Art, due to open later this year. And you can see it here actually pictured in one of the architect's visualizations of the new museum. There is a long-standing association between the museum and the mausoleum, but the story of the Olokun pot demonstrates rather nicely that things don't come to museums to die. The museum is not an end of an object's biography, but as Carmen also articulated, they are part of an ongoing story that may involve objects being transferred to other institutions or being re-socialized in other ways. In my last case example, I want to reflect on the museum as a kind of staging post, a safe space, as it were, to hold objects of uncertain provenance, while collectively reflecting on the most ethical action to take about their future. And here I reflect on a collaboration with Marina Pugliese at MUDEC, the Museum of Cultures in Milan. This project began when Marina approached me for advice regarding a large private collection of ethnographic art objects that had been offered as a donation to the museum following the collector's death. The material had been acquired by the collector over some years through dealers and online platforms, and came with virtually no provenance information. While some of the material falls into the category of tourist art made for the international market, other pieces appear to be authentic, and the circumstances in which they entered the market are unclear. My advice was that most museums would not touch the collection that was likely to fall foul of the 1970 UNESCO Convention on preventing the illicit import, export, and transfer of ownership of cultural property and other similar instruments. But I also raised a question regarding what would happen to the collection if the museum did not take it. And of course, the most likely course would be that the collection would re-enter the private market. What would be more or less ethical, to accept the problematic donation or to refuse it? Museums are often faced with such dilemmas, and yet our ethical guidelines rarely help. Thus, we devised a plan to convene a forum to discuss the problem and to bring the dilemma to the public. Noting a provision within the ICOM Code of Ethics that museums may act as repositories of last resort, MUDEC agreed to receive the unprovenance collection from the family on a temporary basis, while it considered the most appropriate longer-term solution. Curatorial staff then undertook what conventional provenance research was possible, gathering together what contextual information they could find. In the meanwhile, we set about convening our forum in the shape of a 2-day workshop in which we brought together stakeholders representing a diversity of positions and different kinds of expertise, members of communities with cultural associations with the objects, decolonial activists, curators, conservators, a legal expert, an art dealer, a member of the collector's family, myself as anthropologist, as well as a group of students from the local art academy. The workshop took place in the museum's conservation lab, where the collection was temporarily stored. This meant that we were literally surrounded, as it were, by the problem. We also selected a number of case study objects from the collection, and we gathered around each object in turn, drawing on our diverse positionalities to enumerate the particular ethical issues that we perceived in each object and what alternative solutions presented themselves. In the evening, we organized a public event to engage an even wider audience in these ethical deliberations. A filmmaker documented our discussions, while an artist sought to represent our interactions graphically as the event unfolded. And this, I should say, is very much an experiment in the forensis of provenance, a work in progress. And one hope is that we will expand this methodology, perhaps working with other museums, perhaps creating an interactive exhibition around the issues. And I suppose that's the point. The point is that provenance research is always a work in progress. The objective is not to uncover and present the definitive account of an object, though we can certainly enhance our knowledge. Rather, it is to rethink the lessons that collections can teach us. And this, I think, is less about determining the singular truth of an object and more about the questions that objects pose to us and the conversations they convene. And this is one of the graphics that the artist produced with this empty space in the middle. And I suppose what I've been trying to do is to suggest that each of these case studies, and of course, any object of the millions of objects that are in museums could be put in this space, is something that we should bring this kind of forum to think about. So rather than to have set answers, as it were, based on a rather crude notion of ethics, that actually every object has its own complexities, its own stories, and that these kind of collection of voices and perspectives, different kinds of expertise, should gather around each of these objects. And this opens up an idea of what, the museum is there for. Is it to present this authoritative knowledge, or is it there actually to listen in a way, all of us as audience members as well as curators and so on, to listen to these difficult questions sometimes that objects pose to us? Although we try to suppress it, the museum is perhaps above all a space of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the identity of things, about where they came from, where they belong. Uncertainty about whose knowledge or which forms of expertise should be prioritized, about whose voices are more or less legitimate. Uncertainty regarding where to turn for definitive answers, recognizing that in many cases there are none. We need to be better at embracing this uncertainty. It is uncertainty that necessitates the forum, the space to listen, to attend to each other's points of view, and to navigate these matters as best we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. We're going to have a panel discussion, so keep your questions for the end. And I'm going to introduce Ana Pastor Perez, who is our senior project specialist in conservation of archaeological collections. And her background is in both conservation and archaeology. And Anna is going to moderate this panel discussion, and she will introduce the panelists in a minute. But I just wanted to say that Anna has her PhD focused on social archaeological collection, integrating ethnographic techniques and sustainable conservation strategies. And prior to joining the collections department at GCI, she worked at the Norwegian Institute of Cultural Heritage and also the Autonomous University of Barcelona, leading different community-based projects. I also wanted to mention that this event is in collaboration with the Fowler Museum and the UCLA Getty program. So, Anna, the floor is yours.
So I want to ask our other panelists to join me here at the board. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce you to Erica P. Jones. She serves as the manager of Curatorial Affairs and senior curator of African Arts at the Fowler Museum at the UCLA. She has engaged with themes such as the legacy of colonialism in Africa, historical regal arts, and the resonances between Africa and its diasporas in her curatorial work. And with Erica, we have Glenn Wharton, is the chair of the UCLA Getty Interdepartmental Program in the Conservation of Cultural Heritage, as well as the professor of art history and professor of the conservation of material culture. So I wanted to start this discussion, and thank you so much, Paul, also for joining us. Just a little reminder, Paul Basu is a professor at Oxford University and a curator at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I would like to start this conversation with sharing some initial thoughts also with all of you. I think that conservation, whether preventive or curative, is an active agent in adding new narratives or layers to the history of objects in their biographies. However, as Paul has made us reflect, the forensic gaze or approach moves us, conservation practitioners, to an innovative and challenging interdisciplinary understanding of the life of objects and the task of documenting them, crossing disciplines such as archaeology, anthropology, art history, or sociology. Paul transported us to the space of the decolonization of collections, of their paternalization, and of the monolithic uniqueness of some discourses. Paul has also provided us with a tool to combat these power balances and imbalances and inequalities, research on provenance, and of course, its tentative, entanglements with conservation practice. As conservators, we must, therefore, shift our ontology and look at the object from different perspectives. And I ask myself, indeed, is this shift in part the consequence of working with more diverse teams, providing fertile ground for multicultural voices, or is this the result of reactionary changes in the museum environment which attempt to promote meaningful opportunities for traditionally marginalized communities? In this conversation, I hope we can discuss together how your institutions are shaping new models of curatorship, conservation, training, and practice in museums, as well as your views on this. So our panelists today bring a wealth of experience and diverse perspectives on these topics, and we're excited to hear from them. So I will start with you, Erica. I don't know if I'm well placed here, honestly. 1 second. Okay. I'm okay. Thank you. I would like to begin with you, Erica. Could you share with us which interdisciplinary and multicultural strategies you have been employing at the Fowler and how these are affecting your collection's narratives, including the conservation and preservation of your collections?
Yeah. Oh,
Thank you.
thank you. Am I on? Yeah. Well, and thank you, Paul, for that wonderful talk. I feel like I was scribbling notes the whole time. I think at the Fowler, we've become also sort of similarly obsessed with trying to undermine this monolithic narrative of the museum and finding ways to do it. And it is, it's tricky. It really is how to present objects in the gallery, especially when, not to be cynical, but we don't expect most of our viewers to even read the labels. And so there is sort of this element of you put in all this effort to bringing in different narratives, and yet is anyone reading them? And so we've been trying to find ways to do some wayfinding and make it really apparent. So one example I like to turn to is a recent exhibition that we did on the Yoruba Atlantic, and it was called "The House Was Too Small," and there was objects from from Nigeria, from Brazil, and from Cuban American communities. And we worked with this incredibly engaged group of advisors who were practitioners, who were artists, coming from all of these various communities that had other types of knowledge to add to this. And one of the ways we wanted to engage our local diaspora community was to actually have them use the objects and record that and bring that into the gallery. And for us, we're very actively engaged in provenance research towards an end game of return. That is very important at the Fowler, thinking ethically about the history of the objects. But it's also just the truth that most objects will remain. And so how do we continue to activate them? And so working to have local babalawos, these diviners who are working with divination objects that are parts of our collection. And this was a great challenge for our conservator, because we basically said to him, we're going to invite people in to use, to engage in a practice that uses termite dust on the objects, which of course you say the word termite and wood to your conservator and they look at you like you've absolutely lost your mind, that you want to bring in, and so it did become this very sort of exciting challenge to think through what this would mean for the collection as a whole, for safety of the collection. And we felt that the benefits really outweighed the negatives, and we also were saying to ourselves, well, these were all used objects, they've had this kind of termite dust on them before and we're not seeing a problem, so we're probably fine. We're fine. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been expanding our engagement with collections care and pushing the boundaries of that with our conservators and our collections team, all working really in collaboration with community. So it's thinking through other parts of collection care as well, like as an example, working with an iwi with a community in New Zealand who came to view a piece that was from the Wellcome collection as well. That was, we were able to trace directly to their community. And the weavers who were present said, this piece has been in darkness and we don't want it to be alone. And so they wove something that is owned by the piece in the collection, that the Fowler does not own this piece, a piece in the collection owns the piece. And so it is also thinking through different modes of museum practice beyond conservation and what is presented to the public. It's really what's going on for the objects themselves, giving the objects that sense of agency in their own futures. So those are a couple examples, but I'm going to pass it on to Glenn.
That's really, really interesting and exactly in line with these thoughts that Erica has shared with us. We also would love to hear your thoughts, Glenn, on how you incorporate these new perspectives and ideas in your teaching at the UCLA Getty program in the conservation of cultural heritage. What are the drivers of these changes? And explain to us, do you think that do they start from a conscious epistemological shift, or do you feel that these changes are a demand from a more diverse student and staff cohort? Thank you.
Very interesting question. Thank you. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, I guess I need to also start with thanking Paul for shining a light on my field of conservation, because we've often in the past felt somewhat slighted behind the scenes and sometimes deliberately behind the scenes. So I'd just like to say a word about that, about our field, before I talk about our program briefly. When I was doing my doctoral research at the Institute of Archaeology at UCLA, University College London, I was researching the potential for using the conservation moment in an object's life as a moment in which people could come together to discuss the object, its past, its present, and its potential futures, and re-engage people associated with these objects in constructing their own history, their own individual and cultural memories through this process of just learning about the objects from the past and having opportunities to present narratives about the future. So that's really kind of central to what we're now doing in our conservation program at UCLA. we have the great fortune to focus on archaeological and indigenous cultural heritage. So we're really sort of a niche program within our field. We don't do paintings, we don't do contemporary art. There's a whole lot of things we don't do, but being able to focus on archaeological and indigenous cultural heritage gives us the opportunity to rethink the past and the present and people associated with these objects. So your question about an epistemological shift, I would say yes. We are deliberately working to change what conservation is all about. So it's not only about preserving material objects for the future, but it's also about engaging people in the present with these objects to bring new meanings, to bring new uses or continue uses. And so part of what we wanted to do was engage people connected with these objects in these processes. So we've been very deliberate about seeking people from communities associated with the objects into our program as students, as staff, as faculty. And so the second part of your question, once they arrive, they have their own demands. So yes, it's become a very lively place where our students, who many of them are indigenous or from underrepresented populations, learning about the sort of scientific care of their collections and bringing their own cultural knowledge to this discussion of what to do with these objects. And so like our master's students, every single one of them is getting a master's certificate in restitution repatriation through the Waystation initiative at the Coast Institute of Archaeology, for instance. A number of our PhD students are looking at traditional care practices that have been completely ignored by our field and learning how they're in fact much more sustainable than the kind of scientific methods that we've been using. So that kind of conversation, negotiating these two or multiple worlds of knowledge, and our faculty also, Tiago Puglieri, for instance, is bringing his chemistry and his science to his field work with indigenous populations in the Amazon and Brazil to re-engage and stimulate conversations about the past. So I'd say it's very, very much alive in our program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution. That made me also reflect a lot in the words of Carmen Vida when she mentioned that conservation is not neutral. And we are a total active agent in conservation of these objects. So now I will move the conversation towards some cross-cutting issues that Paul's conversation has mentioned and our perspective in our different works. So my next question is for you all. And I would like to ask you about agency in provenance research and practice and what drives this agency, this research in provenance. Is it a demand from the diverse communities overlooked in the past, or is it an academic commodity? What is our agency in this interdisciplinary approach as professionals in cultural heritage? Do you want to follow up on this, Paul?
I'll give it a try to begin with. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very ambiguous thing because I was trying to say that we need to relinquish as cultural institutions, museums, universities, galleries, and so on, relinquish control, but actually we still have the control. So at the moment, pretty much all the agency actually sits with those institutions, which is part of the problem, of course. They remain the kind of gatekeeper, albeit inviting others in, but they make the invitation, So in that sense, I think there is, there's still a lot of work to be done to rethink this kind of relationship. I think it depends very much on the individual institution, whether it feels that it's responding to a demand or is being proactive I think increasingly it's a kind of proactive kind of approach, which recognises that at the very least, one should be transparent about providing access to knowledge about what's kept by those institutions. Again, a lot of databases were, until relatively recently, you would have had to make an appointment, you would have had to have a kind of a training to be able to even access them. So a lot of that's online now, which makes it easier, but many of the fields are not made public. So there are hidden fields, there are public fields, but then if you actually look at the data that's available, it's usually very limited, and that's not through a kind of the agency of withholding information. It's simply that, as I tried to discuss in some of the examples, that there's very little known. A lot of material was just purchased at auction, where you literally have those one-line kind of descriptions, which are very unreliable often. So that's where, I'm trying to push that to think about all that we don't know, rather than this idea that institutions know it all and they're making decisions about what to release. Often institutions also know very little, So it's also about being honest about that. It's undermining our own kind of authority to say, actually, we don't really know what that is,
And as I'm sure you've experienced with welcome collection material, I think another reason that museums will also hold back some of the data that they put out there is that it is so disturbingly racist, and using terminology that there is a desire to not have anyone from a descendant community or source community stumble upon while they're going through a collection online. So there is sort of a sense of what is our ethical obligation to any constituency around the world as we're sharing information. I also think that to the question of agency, I also find that more and more people are talking about joint stewardship agreements and ways of trying to bring in really a legal understanding of multiple people having access to the care and the future for objects in museums, even if they're not the legal owners, hopefully as a means to sort of chip away at this sort of control that museums hold.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I guess I was talking about agency before, but I think the conservators do have a particular agency because they are, as Carmen said, telling stories about objects through their own actions and communicating knowledge about these objects through their repairs, caretaking, filling in, painting. So I think it's just very important for multiple voices to be in on those decisions. There's just huge potential to engage people with the past through conservation.
And if I just come back on that, there's also the agency of determining who should have agency. and one would, the automatic response is, well, a source community, a descendant community. But as I was, again, trying to just problematize that a little bit, we use very simplistic understandings of these things, actually. It requires a huge investment to actually do field work around every object, to actually really understand. And then it's very contested. Who should speak, Even in restitution context, is it a national museum that may be divorced entirely from the community where something came from? It's often, at a very local level that the kind of knowledge exists. It's part of the problem is that we've typologized and categorized things, which reduce them just to examples of, specimens of a ... But actually they're unique. Everything is unique. Its meaning, its use, and so on. And we can also project things that aren't there. Things were made for the market, made for even Victorian anthropological collectors. They were made. So not everything that looks like something is something, and it has different agency as a thing. So it's this notion of being able to easily answer these questions was also what I was trying to raise, that actually we've got some work to do just to kind of think through those kind of things and take those issues seriously.
Exactly. And to add one more layer in this argument that you are all sharing with us in this line, how can this conservation that you are all framing contribute to this relationship building between communities and institutions in order to be part of the wider debates happening in museums regarding authenticity, ownership, and accessibility? Start?
You know, I just also want to say that the work that we're talking about, as you've alluded to, is very time-consuming and intensive. And the real life of most conservators, whether they're in private practice or in museums, is that they have impossibly busy schedules. They're driven by exhibitions or private clients who need things right away, who don't want to pay for all this extra work. So it takes a proactive institution or proactive people to create the kind of space that's required for doing this kind of work. So I just wanted to add that in, that it's difficult, it's messy, it's really, once you open the doors and bring in multiple people with different points of view, they have different points of view, and then you might enter, a process of conflict negotiation or discussing whose agency is going to be recognized within an institutional framework where there is also laws, legal agreements. So it gets very complicated, but I think it's necessary as a way to move forward. I'm sorry, I'm not sure I answered your question, but it was just so much on my mind, I had to address it.
Are the conservators of the future trained for this type of multi-temporal conservation, I guess, to this?
Well, I suppose we pre-select our students through the application process, but the students we get are ready when they hit the ground, when they arrive. As I said, they're all interested in restitution, repatriation, community engagement. We just taught a course last quarter on conservation community, where our students were working with community members in two different Latino collection and African American collection. And so they're being prepared to do this kind of work in our program anyway. So.
I feel like they're prepared for the idea of it, but I think we're so rarely prepared for the realities of doing the work, right? That it is, as you alluded to, it's so time-consuming and it's also so expensive. That this is we discussed in advance, bringing in politics to this conversation, but we look at the funding landscape for this kind of work in this country going forward, and it's bleak. And this is something where if you're doing it right and you're bringing in voices, you're also compensating people for their time and their expertise. And that's I think it's really important to think about how we compensate different types of knowledge. And that is, I feel like we start out a project and we know how we want to do it, and then getting to that finish line is truly, that's the hard part, not the idea sometimes.
Yeah, I'd like to, given that situation, I think it's worth just thinking of, the broader rethinking of what a museum is. Museums have, mostly been pedagogical spaces. And I think this still holds, but what is it that we come to them to learn, So I suppose in what I was trying to get at a little bit there was that we should come away from this idea that we're coming to learn from some authoritative teacher figure, the museum, the curatorial voice, what have you, about something we don't know about, and rather think that we come to the museum or other cultural spaces to share in this thinking. Often we bring all kinds of knowledges that are often not recognized or valued within those institutions. We bring our perspective on something. And to me, that idea, which shifts as being a way, being something that one does in addition to, we put on our regular exhibition, cycle and so on, which is still in the old kind of mode of doing things, and then we do this on the side, but it's rather shifting actually. Not that every exhibition is about the politics of putting the exhibition on, but actually really attending, listening to the things, listening to the problems that come, thinking about them together, that kind of open-ended idea of an exhibition as an invitation to participate actually in an ongoing conversation.
Can I just add one small thing that,
Please.
you know, as I mentioned, that if we're shifting the goals of conservation from just preserving objects of the past to focusing on the present and people's engagement with them, then that also shifts how we're thinking about priorities. Maybe we don't clean every painting and in-paint them as well as we do, but we spend more time with people, engaging them, and that sort of rethinking the role of the museum as well, from being just a top-down educational institution to being a place where democracy can be practiced, where people can come together to learn how to voice their opinion in public. And so just really shifting what museum and conservation is all about.
With the last question of today, because I think that so far we have covered so many topics. So to close this fruitful conversation with a very positive and broad outlook for the future, what do you think, what is the role of institutions like ours in generating new perspectives in museum practices that contribute to social justice?
I mean, it's about remaining open to all new ideas for working, right? It's as Paul is saying, it's this idea of, it's an invitation, a museum as an invitation. And I think it's coming up with the new ways of doing that we haven't thought of yet. I think that maybe this is a moment of, you know, whenever there's a challenge, it's actually a moment of great opportunity. And what are the creative ideas that we can use to sort of propel new modes of engagement, new modes of conversation? That's not really an answer. It's just also being hopeful.
I mean, I think particularly you say institutions like ours, the Getty and so on. I mean, I suppose there's the privilege that the Getty has, that there are resources, Erica mentioned the kind of, very challenging, broader political context and so on. But, how to use that privilege in the right kinds of ways, is that about kind of continuing with a certain kind of privileged way of engaging with art, for instance? Or is it actually about, democratization, as you say? But yeah, creativity. This shouldn't be something earnest. This should be something that's exciting and thrilling and engaging, that actually we want to, as members of the public, want to engage in these places and these things. So I'd say, yeah, that would be another thing about how to use privilege where it exists to, prioritize, as Fenn's saying there, about what kinds of programming do we do, how much effort do we put into actually reaching out, being experimental, embracing uncertainty, I'd say, feeling more comfortable with saying we don't know, but it's not that knowing is the important thing, it's the posing of the question, what are the right questions we should be thinking about together,
I guess I'll just answer by telling you just about one little project that we did in one of our courses last quarter, which is called Museums and Communities, where students went out to La Historia and the Museum of African Art in Los Angeles, and people associated with these museums were asked to bring objects of personal value to these clinics. And the conservation students met with them and talked to them, heard their stories about these objects. And the objects are going to be selected. Some of them will undergo further research and conservation and engagement with people from just their everyday objects. So that's just one example of how we're trying to really shift what conservation is all about and who it's for.
Much for that contribution. That reminds me one of the slides of Paul when he said epistemic value transformed to moral value. This is a thing a thought to reflect on this. But Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much for your previous talk too. Thank you so much, Erica and Glenn. And thank you to Stavrola Golfamitsu for carrying on also this initiative in the first term. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. And I think there will be some refreshments outside so we can continue these conversations in a low level, not recorded, outside. Thank you so much.